She then went on to recite charms she said she'd heard her brother use.
Upon Good Friday I will fast while I may, a cross of blue and another of red, as good Lord was to the rude. Gabriel laid him down to sleep upon the ground.
What we've got here is a series of half-understood, maybe quarter-understood recollections of prayers, practices, rites of popular Catholicism, and a bit of a play text.
That I can neither sleep nor wake. Rise up, Gabriel, and go
swirled together into something that would sound impressive to a listener as a healing chant.
Sweet Jesus, our Lord, Amen.
Potts was impressed by Janet's testimony. In fact, he seemed to relish her calm, clear and chilling account. Although she were but very young, yet it was wonderful to the court with what modesty, government and understanding she delivered this evidence against the prisoner at the bar, being her own natural brother.
An adult would know that what they were saying was likely to lead to Mum and Grandma being hanged. And I don't think Janet did really know in the way an adult would know. I think she only knew it intellectually and not emotionally. And that's why I think her mother screams at her in the way she does. I think her mother is desperately trying, at least to make her realize what she's done.
She's clearly a rather odd child. She's extremely articulate. She clearly doesn't like her family. She's a bit different from the others. We don't know who her father was. She's the only illegitimate child. And clearly either she's really terrified of the magistrates and determined to save herself at all costs, or more probably, it gives her a chance for all sorts of concealed resentments and animosities against her family to explode lethally.
I think we need to imagine that she believes in the reality of witchcraft and that these people really are witches and that she seeks to distance herself from them. Of course, she's also being put under a great deal of pressure. It may be direct pressure, it may just be the atmospheric pressure of the courtroom, the tension of all these men around her are telling her that in fact the witchcraft has taken place and that she's the linchpin in punishing it.
It wasn't just her own family Janet was prepared to denounce as witches. Alice Nutter and her friends were more well-to-do, and the judge was more demanding of evidence against them. He arranged identity parades, mixing them in with other prisoners from the castle. One by one, Janet picked them out.
You were there on Good Friday. You had on the prettiest dress. You ate the mutton. You were sitting right by me.
In an attempt to catch her out, the judge then asked, "Did you see Joanna's style, a made-up name?"
No, sir, I never heard of her.
Most of the early modern witch hunters rely on the Bible and or the texts by the great continental demonologists as their texts. The Lancashire witch trials are really unusual in that they ignore these pretty well completely and fasten on the King's own book, King James's Demonology. And in a way that's extremely rare, they're plainly ticking boxes. King James says witches use body parts for evil magic. Body parts are found, the Lancashire witches' property. They make clay images. Whoops, it's what the Lancashire witches are supposed to be doing. Children are extremely useful as witnesses. Wow, we suddenly have Janet. So what these people are doing is looking upwards to the monarch as their fount of wisdom.
The evidence against the prisoners had stacked up perfectly.
We tend to assume that witchcraft was just one big delusion and therefore that the witches who were convicted were in fact innocent. But accused witches believed in witchcraft too. And I think it's improbable to think that witches never tried to use magic in order to kill somebody. Well, today we prosecute people and punish them if they attempt a crime but are unsuccessful. So the witches of 1612, by that measure, were they innocent?
By the end of the two-day trial, the jury had decided that all of Janet's family and most of her neighbours were guilty of causing death or harm by witchcraft. 10 people were sentenced to hang. Elizabeth Devis, Alison Devis, James Devis, Anne Whittle, Anne Redfern, Isabel Roby, Alice Nutter, Jane Bulcock, John Bulcock, Catherine Hewitt. The day after the trial, the 10 convicted prisoners were brought to a place still known as Gallows Hill.
This was a piece of state theatre. This was the moment when the majesty of God and the majesty of the law were very much focused on this one event, and everybody could see the power of it. At the critical moment, the witch was led out, forced to climb the ladder, the noose put over her neck, and then at that moment the crowd went rather quiet. They didn't die from having her neck broken, but from slow strangulation that might take as long as 20 minutes. In fact, there are accounts of friends and family coming forward and pulling on the legs of the poor person being executed in order to hasten their end.
Condemned prisoners were expected to make one final confession. It was a last chance to save their souls, though not, of course, their lives. We're told that Elizabeth and Alice Nutter never confessed, not even with their dying words.
I think it's probably very likely, based on the standards of the day, that Janet would have been encouraged to be there too.
A lot of history's most ghastly locations are completely transformed now. This is a park where kids come to play football and do whatever kids do in parks these days. For me, the most chilling thought about what happened here was the idea that Janet might well have been watching the hangings, and the last thing that Elizabeth might have seen as she looked out from the gallows might have been the face of her daughter, the child who put her there. We don't know anything about what happened to the orphaned Janet Devis in the years that followed the execution of her entire family and most of her neighbours. It's difficult to imagine anybody wanting to take her in, but it could be argued that they weren't her last victims. Thanks to Potts's published account, Janet's influence would travel far beyond Lancashire. Although there had been earlier cases of children being heard as witnesses in witch trials, the law stated that children under the age of 14 were not credible witnesses as they could not be sworn under oath. But that was set to change. Imagine you're a 17th century JP or magistrate. You're not trained in the law like the judges are, but you need to investigate, question witnesses, and compile a case for the assize. What you need is one handy book that gives you all the basics, something that you can just pull off the shelf whenever you need it. The Country Justice is that book. It's by a man called Dalton and was first published in 1618. This handbook was used by all magistrates both here and in the colonies in America. You've got some people accused of witchcraft, so you look up Advice on Witnesses, see page 541, and here it is. For children, I find in the book of the discovery of witches at Lancaster Assizes, that's Thomas Potts's book, that the son and daughter, that's Janet and James, of Elizabeth Devis, a witch, here we go, the one about 9 years of age, the other of 14, did, upon their oaths, give open evidence against their mother, then prisoner at the bar. So what Janet did in 1612 ended up giving a precedent to magistrates, not just here, but across the Atlantic, to seek the testimony of children in trials of witchcraft. And before we say that this is outrageous, let's remember that today there are still trials which rely on child testimony due to lack of alternative witnesses. Today, the testimony of children as young as 3 has been used in criminal trials. The law says that they have to understand the questions put to them and to give answers which are understandable. And the most extraordinary thing was that Janet herself would come to fall victim to the very precedent she set. In November 1633, 22 years after the 9-year-old Janet testified against her family, a 10-year-old boy from Pendle came home late one evening and told his parents a very strange story. Edmund Robinson explained that the reason he was late was that he'd been picking berries. And while gathering berries, he said he'd seen 2 greyhounds. I tried to get them to chase a hare, but they didn't run, so I beat them with a stick. One of the dogs turned into a witch and the other into a boy, and she then turned him into a horse. The witch took me away on the horse to that house, Horstones, and their barn was full of witches, maybe 60 of them, and from the ceiling there were all these ropes hanging down, and they were pulling on the ropes, and amazing food came falling down. I was so frightened, so I ran away, and they chased me for ages. And before I got home, I met a boy with cloven hooves, so I fought him. That's why I'm so scruffy. It's not my fault. All of which seems to have been accepted as a genuine reason for lateness, somewhat surprisingly. After hearing this story, the boy's father took him from village to village to stand in the churches and point out the witches he had seen. For 3 months. The curate of a local church described seeing Edmund at work. The boy was brought into the church of Kildwick and was set upon a stall to look about him, which moved some little disturbance in the congregation for a while. And after prayers, the people told me that it was the boy that discovered witches. On the evidence of Edmund's bizarre story, about 20 people were imprisoned and put on trial in February 1634. One of them was called Janet Devis, accused of killing Isabel, wife of William Nutter.
I can see absolutely no reason to think that it's not the same Janet Devis from the earlier Lancashire trial that's accused by Edmund Robinson.
But the fact that someone of the same name appears as a suspect in the second trial with some of the same families involved in the same place, I think is very suggestive. I think really there's no reason to suspect that it's not her.
Again, it's the stories the children tell that have such an incredible power. Not only Edmund's story in 1633, but the words Janet used back in 1612 have returned to haunt her. She'd been a witness for the Crown as a 9-year-old and had been spared the noose. But this time, surely, she'd hang. Yet these were different times, and England had changed since 1612.
When we look back into the 17th century, we think of what happened before the 17th century. We think of a world where witches were persecuted, where people relied on what other people said, everybody was suspicious, everybody was very uncertain. It was a time of great political and religious uncertainty. And then when you look forward to the 18th century, you've got a sense of order and stability. So the 17th century was a period of transition.
When Thomas Potts wrote his book, he thought he'd be pleasing the king with his account. But James's continued interest in witch trials led him to become more sceptical.
Something very important happens at Leicester in 1616. A boy, maybe 12, 13 years old, claims that he's bewitched. The case goes to trial, and 9 women are hanged. Well, the following month, James I goes to Leicester. He interviews the boy and discovers that he's lying. And then, as a consequence, the judges are very soundly rebuked. And this goes out as a message to other judges to be very, very cautious in witchcraft cases, particularly if your star witness happens to be a child.